an issue that I'm seeing come up over and over on subject to transactions where I'm being consulted or brought in after the purchase contract is executed, and I'm then reviewing the purchase contract and trying to figure out all the different moving parts for the transaction. And the issue that I'm seeing is not properly outlining the purchase price and not properly outlining the amount of money to be paid to the seller from the transaction. And what I mean by that is when you're purchasing a property subject to, you may or may not know the purchase price depending on how you structure the transaction. So, for example, let's say that your purchase price is going to be $500,000. There's an existing loan for $400,000. That's the original principal balance of the existing loan, as shown by the recorder's website. And then you're going to be bringing $100,000 to the table and paying that amount to the seller. And the idea is that your cash at closing is going to be $100,000. It's not going to be $105,000, $110,000, or otherwise. It's going to be $100,000 cash at closing. And so let's say hypothetically that you go and obtain a payoff for that existing loan, and that existing loan has a payoff of, instead of $400,000, it has a payoff of $380,000. Well, if that purchase price is a static purchase price and is not structured in such a way that it adjusts for a lower payoff of the existing loan, well, then somewhere you have to make up the difference. So you either, and that's likely, you're going to have to bring an extra $20,000 to the table to bring up the difference to get to that purchase price if the payoff's 480 or 380, excuse me, instead of 400. And now you're stuck, like, what do I do? And so you have basically two options. You can do an amendment with the seller if the seller will sign it, which basically adjusts the purchase price downward to adjust for that 20,000, or you bring in the extra $20,000 to the table, which you didn't plan to bring in. You plan to bring in exactly $100,000 to, plus whatever costs are allocated to the buyer to close the transaction. So you have to structure the purchase price and have clauses in there that deal with these scenarios. So first, your purchase price should be the payoff amount of the existing loans as of close of escrow, plus the cash at close of escrow amount, or plus the earnest money and the cash at close of escrow amount. Or you should have a clause in there if say the seller is going to net an amount from escrow, like there's an amount that the seller is supposed to net, like this is what the seller is going to be paid after everything's said and done. You should have a clause, a net to seller clause, which basically says the seller will be paid this amount from close of escrow only, nothing less, nothing more. And the purchase price and cash at close of escrow amounts shall be adjusted so that the seller nets exactly or is paid exactly this amount from the close of escrow. You need to have those clauses in place. And if you don't, then you have a problem because you have an ambiguity in your contract and it can't close. And now you're going back to the seller trying to get an amendment done. And unfortunately, I've seen this where the seller's like, no, I want the extra money at closing. I'm not going to sign an amendment. So then you have an issue and you have to figure out how you're going to handle it. And I've seen it where it's, unfortunately cost my clients money because the seller won't play, but they're play ball and negotiate, not negotiate, but sign an addendum to effectuate really what the intent of the parties was, even though it wasn't properly documented. But I've also seen the seller execute the addendum at times as well, but it's a problem and it holds up closing and it has to be dealt with. So my advice is, and my legal update is this: if you are doing a subject to, please don't just willy-nilly fill out the purchase price information and the subject to, seller financing information and the cash at close of escrow, the earnest money information, and just assume that it's all going to work out at closing. You really have to think through the transaction and say, okay, when it comes to close, what exactly is happening here? And you have to properly outline that and document it. And, it may just involve simply consulting with an attorney prior to filling out the contract and saying, okay, I need help figuring out this purchase price so that it does what I want at closing. Or I want the seller to receive X amount of dollars. So what do I put into the contract to ensure that the seller receives that amount and that all other numbers are adjusted so that that seller receives that amount, nothing less, nothing more from the closing. But if you don't do that and you just willy-nilly use maybe a form that's, not set up for a subject to transaction and you try to modify it, or you even use a form, but you don't know how to fill it out correctly, you're going to end up costing yourself money, or the buyer's going to end up costing themselves money. So my advice is please, please think about the purchase price. And it seems like a simple thing, like we'll just fill it all out, but it's not. It's very complicated if you have a number of moving parts that need to be dealt with at closing. Fill out the purchase price the right way, structure it the right way so that the transaction can close properly and, close based upon the actual intent of the parties.